Welcome to the history of creativity. Today we will discuss Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. These great civilizations we call trading creativity, and you'll find out why a little later. The Minoans are kind of the forgotten civilization of the world. They lived on the island of Crete, very geographically small, south of the main peninsula of Greece, toward the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. The people who lived in Crete probably came from Phoenicia, that is nearby on the mainland of Asia, in an area that we today call the Levant, and is part of Lebanon. These people, the Phoenicians from the city of Byblos, were the sea people of ancient records. But the people on Crete had a problem. The problem was simply they didn't have any major rivers, they had poor and insufficient food, and therefore they needed to do something to create a livelihood. And that thing that they created was trade. That is how they were going to live. But what is needed to conduct trade? Well, you need goods to sell, ships to transport the goods. You need contacts in foreign ports, we call that sales. You need storage facilities, and you need an accounting system so that you can keep track of the transactions. The Minoans were very creative in developing all of these things. Let's look at them one by one. First of all, goods to sell. They could grow olives, and therefore they had a thriving business in olive oil. They also could grow grapes, and therefore they had a good business in wine. They could make saffron, that's a spice made from the crocus plant, very expensive, highly prized, and therefore they could make a good living by trading in saffron. In addition to that, they also made metals. It's interesting that the word copper is the same derivation as the word Cyprus, that is an island that is to the east of Crete, and surely the Minoan people went over to Cyprus, they got copper, and then they traded it throughout the extensive network that they established for trade within the Mediterranean. They were also able to trade grains. That's not to say that they grew the grains themselves. They were just simply merchants. They would go to Egypt, chiefly, buy the grain, and then in their own ships they would distribute that grain throughout their trading zone in the eastern Mediterranean. Let's take a look at Minoan pottery. It's interesting that pottery is really an essential for trade. It is what you carry things in. For instance, you might want to carry wheat or oil or wine, and you had to have something to serve as the vessel. And therefore the Minoans created very nice pottery to serve as the vessels for this transport. But here's a question that we need to examine. Why is the pottery decorated? Is it something useful, or is it just simply art for art's sake? Well, maybe it's art for art's sake. They certainly had other things that showed art. They had jewelry, little statuettes. They had beautiful wall paintings. So maybe it was just for art, but maybe it was for profit. And we ask ourselves, why would a decorated pot bring more money or allow more profit to be made than an undecorated pot? Maybe it was kind of like a trademark, or it might have been some way of enhancing the quality of the product or identifying the quality of the product. Whatever it was, we certainly see the Minoan pots were highly decorated. Now let's take a look at the way these goods were transported, that is, the ships. We can see here a Minoan pot, and on the pot is a picture of a ship. We have two different ways of representing that. One is another drawing of a ship, and on the other side is a replica. that has been made from the drawing that we see on the pot. Here are some other drawings of Minoan ships, and as you can see, they are similar, but they all have some little characteristics that are very interesting to us. We can actually categorize these ships that were used in the ancient Minoan and later Mycenaean periods. We can take a look at some that are for king transport, and here we see pictures of a ship that is to transport some royalty. We can see a place where the royal person would sit in the back of the ship. Here are some Nile ships. Very interesting because they're simpler. They did not generally go into the Mediterranean. In the Nile, or in the Egyptian culture around the Nile, these ships just simply sailed up the Nile or down the Nile. And up the Nile, they usually waited until there was a favorable wind. Down the Nile, all they had to do was float with the river. Occasionally they went out into the Mediterranean, but it was quite difficult because Nile ships are relatively shallow drafted. That is, they don't go down very deep, and therefore they're good for the river, but not so good out in a larger body of water like the Mediterranean. And we see fishing boats or funeral boats and sailboat in these pictures. In addition to that, we see some of the Greek innovative boats. One is called a pentaconter. That's a single banked row of oars. Or we see a bireme. That's pretty much the same ship, but it has two rows of oars, two rows in which oars can be located. The ultimate ship, the best that the Greeks made, is called a trireme. And here we see a sketch of a trireme and even some cross sections where you can see three different layers of rowers. And because this was often the means of locomotion for the ship, three is better than two, which is better than one because they go faster. One of the other advantages of the trireme is that it is really a guided missile. It's a warfare device. Let's take a look at a video now that shows how that is done.
The trireme consisted of 170 rowers on 3 separate levels, 62 on the top level, 54 in the middle, and 54 on the bottom. On the lowest level, rowers were seated so deep in the ship that their oar ports were just 18 inches above the waterline. The Themistocles' fleet of triremes was finished in just a few years and in the nick of time. In the spring of 480 BC, Persia launched a massive invasion of Greece. Themistocles knew that the Persian fleet outnumbered the combined Greek fleet by almost 2 to 1, so he devised a simple yet cunning plan to keep the Greeks together and level the odds. Themistocles would devise a ruse to lure the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. On the eve of the battle, Themistocles sent a trusted servant across the straits to the Persian camp. The servant played the role of a traitor, telling the Persian king the Greeks were in disarray, and if the Persians sent their ships in the night, they could surprise the Greek navy in the morning.
So it was a perfect setup of a battle by Themistocles.
Now 200 triremes, powered by 34,000 Greek rowers, formed into a line. There was no room for the Persians to maneuver in the narrow straits. Themistocles had sprung the perfect trap. The attacks raged all day long as the Greek triremes encircled the Persian ships, then pounded them with their forward rams. The battle was so confused, chaotic, and unnerving that at the end of the day, the Greeks weren't even sure that they had won. But thousands of lifeless enemy bodies on the shores of Salamis revealed a decisive Greek victory.
Here we can see some other characterizations of ships. This is a ship where present day they are trying to model some of the ancient types, and you can see this person working to try and make a wooden ship of an ancient design. And this kind of ship would be quite good for the Mediterranean. It has a fairly deep draft, but not too deep. If you really want to go out into the ocean, like the Atlantic, much rougher seas, much more difficult, And a shallow drafted boat like this one would have difficulty in the ocean. Therefore, we have to wait for another 1,000 years or more before a ship that is really ocean-worthy is developed. Those first ships were the Viking ships, and then after the Viking ships, we see the Portuguese and Spanish developing ships that are suitable for oceanic crossings. But at this point, all we have is ships that are good enough for the Mediterranean. But in LDS understanding, we know of some other ships that might be quite interesting. Here is a sketch, a map, showing the possible route of Lehi and Nephi as they came out of Jerusalem, down the coast of Saudi Arabia, and across the southern part of Saudi Arabia. In the Book of Mormon it says, and from that point on we went near due eastward, and you can see where their path goes eastward, and it hits the ocean. Actually, it hits the Arabian Sea over in the southern part of Saudi Arabia. And at that point, we have the Land Bountiful. Here is a video that talks about Nephi's ship and the new and interesting technology that Nephi was given by revelation. Remember now that his society would have been unfamiliar with ocean-going ships, and yet Nephi would have had to go in the ocean.
We know more about what Nephi's ship was not than we do of what it was, because of this phrase, not after the manner of men. What does that mean? Does that mean that the ships that were built in Egypt, the ships that were built in Greece, the ships that were built in Arabia were not going to be copied?
There's a clear indicator in the language of chapter 17 of 1 Nephi that Nephi received a vision of his boat, of his ship. Naturally, Nephi has the advantage of the Lord's instruction, certainly in overall design, maybe even in building techniques.
What finally took Columbus's ships across the Atlantic was a deep, tall hull. The deep, tall hull had to be built skeleton first. This was not done regularly at the time of Nephi. Is this what Nephi means when he says that he had not built it after the manner of men? The manner of men were building the hull first and then adding the skeleton. Building the skeleton first would have meant that Nephi's ship could have been taller and also deeper into the water. That Nephi, in fact, turned it around and built the skeleton first and then added the hull. This, in fact, would be the innovation. All of the ships that we see in the region during this period have either a single or dual rudder systems that run down the side of the ship near to the stern. The rudder was of huge importance while sailing over open seas, because it was the rudder that would be used to tack the vessel to pick up wind, or in fact to get the vessel out of danger if a squall was to come up all of a sudden. If you did not have good, efficient rudders, the ship would founder. When we look at Nephi's ship, he must have had the dual rudder system. A single rudder would not have been able to control a vessel on the open ocean. Nephi mentions nothing about the sails themselves. He does tell us that he sailed the vessel, but he mentions nothing about these sails. So probably they were not different. They did not have either the curious workmanship or the difference that he prescribes to the vessel itself. Nephi's vessel must have had a large rectangular sail.
There's a small dwarf palm that grows here in these mountains. It makes a very fine, excellent cordage. One of the unique features of that particular type of rope is that, unlike other ropes which degrade when exposed to water, the dwarf palm rope actually strengthens and toughens when exposed to water.
Book of Mormon scholars have often talked about how large this ship had to be. Space is a modern luxury. We know that pre-modern peoples did not have the concerns about space that we do. We focus on the idea of time, of speed, of space, luxuries, in fact, to pre-modern peoples. Pre-modern technology was much more utilitarian. And so the notion that you needed to have a large amount of space for a family or a person was simply not the case. I feel that the Nephi ship need not have been longer than 35 or 40 feet.
How long might it have taken? Minimum 2 to 3 years.
We know that Nephi never doubted when the Lord came down and told him to build a naval vessel of this sort. We know, however, that his brothers were full of doubt. Certainly, they recognized that Nephi was not a trained shipbuilder.
At the end of the project, everyone was impressed, including and especially those who resisted helping Nephi early on.
We do know that at the end, that Laman looks at the vessel and goes, wow, that's pretty awesome. You've done a pretty good job. And for a compliment from his brother, that must have been a pretty impressive vessel.
Now, back to the Minoans. The Minoan trade dominated the Aegean Sea. Here we see a map with lots of different trade routes, all centered around the island of Cyprus, the Minoan capital. And we know that Minoans went to all of these places because we have found tablets where the language or the script written on the tablet was called Linear A, and we know that that writing system is native to the Minoan culture. We don't know how to read Linear A, and yet we're confident that it has to do with Minoans, and so we can see Minoan influence throughout this entire region. But you might ask, well, why don't we know more about the Minoans? What happened to the Minoans? And now we can discuss the destruction of the Minoan civilization. Minoan society mysteriously ceased to exist a few hundred years BC. We're not quite sure, but we have some pretty good ideas of why that society ceased to exist, and we think it might have had to do with the explosion, the volcanic eruption that occurred on an island that today is called Santorini, but anciently was called Terra. Let's take a look at some of the effects of that great explosion on Terra. The pumice, or the volcanic ash, is over 40 feet thick, and we know that because archaeologists have gone out and scraped away the topsoil and measured that volcanic layer. In addition, we know that the gas emitted by this tremendous explosion was sulfur dioxide, a highly poisonous gas. There are other explosions that we know about that have reported the same kind of poisonous gas, and we're very confident that the one on Terra would have had that same gaseous problem. In addition to that, there would have been a tremendous tsunami, and we will talk about that tsunami in a few moments, because there is a scientist who has gone to Crete, and he has seen evidence of a tsunami over 60 feet deep. In addition to that, there would have been cold weather for several years following the eruption. And that's because the ash layer would have been very stable in the air over the Mediterranean, perhaps over the entire world, and it would have significantly lowered the temperature, and that would have caused some famine in the areas. So now let's take a look at a video that discusses how people have simulated various parts of this tremendous explosion that occurred in Terra.
The team are now certain what caused the wave, but just how big was it? And what damage could it have done? At the lab, Costas can finally produce his detailed computer model of the height, length, and width of the wave.
We've created the monster.
The red and green peaks show the highest points of the tsunami.
The size of the wave here, so just to give you a comparison, is equivalent to what the wave looked like off Sri Lanka and off Thailand. And you know how many people died in Thailand, how many people died in Sri Lanka. I mean, Thailand reached 20 meters. It's the same size wave right here.
20 meters.
But the real shock isn't just the size of the tsunami. It's the realization that there were several of them.
It's having a party.
When the caldera collapsed, it sent several walls of water out into the Aegean, like a pebble dropping into a pond. These waves cannoned around the islands and bounced off them in a deadly game of tsunami pinball.
It's coming in. It's now, yeah.
Crete was hit by several rebounding waves.
What are the intervals between
Well,
these, with this wave traffic? What are the
let's have a look
intervals
how
between?
this is about 33 minutes. And now we have
the first wave coming in.
and now you have the second one, and that's at 46 minutes. And then you have another wave in about half an hour later, which is not as big, but I mean it has to be terrifying because by that time everything, I mean the people have run away, maybe some people are coming back to help, you know, the wounded, to try to find.
One of the other things that we have discussed as a necessity for trade is accounting. Let's take a look at how the Greeks numbered. One of the differences between the Greek numbering system and others is that the Greeks used their letters, the letters of the alphabet, as a number. And they distinguished the difference between the letter and the number with a little tick mark, a little, a mark above the letter. Therefore, we can see in this example the number 11 written as iota, alpha, with the little tick mark. And the tick mark just simply means this is a number. The iota comes from the number 10 because iota is the 10th letter of the Greek alphabet, and alpha comes from the 1 because it is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Therefore, by writing iota alpha with the tick mark, we have written 11. Just to show you how it works in a little more complicated situation, let's take a look at the number 275. Here we see the numbers for 275, and again, let's write down the Greek alphabet for a few more numbers. That gets us into the 100s. And here we can see that the first, second, and third letters correspond to the 200, the 70, and the 5. We can even go to a number as difficult as 2,339, and in this case, to make things more uniform, the little tick mark is moved to the front in any case where the number is greater than 999. So we can now see that all of those numbers, again, pertain to various locations within the Greek alphabet. Finally, what do we do with numbers that are larger than 9,999? Well, in those cases, we use an M, which stands for myriad. That is the largest number in the Greek alphabet or in the Greek language. So we would represent 11,339 with a little tick mark and then an M standing for myriad, and then the other numbers would be written as we've had in the past. Numbers over 19,999 would have a little superscript over the M, such as a little beta. As you can tell, this accounting system was terrible. Very, very difficult, very confusing, hard to master, hard to understand. If you missed the little tick mark, you'd think that you were reading letters and words rather than numbers. And it has caused tremendous problems throughout the years because people have been unable to understand Greek numbers very well. And often you would be off by a power of 10 and not even know it. It would be very difficult to even understand. So, as you can see, we just need to take it easy when we try and interpret Greek numbers too literally. That, by the way, also goes with Hebrew numbers, which had difficulties for other reasons, and numbers in the Greek-written New Testament are also a little bit questionable sometimes because of the difficulty of these numbers. So we should be a little bit cautious of numbers that come out of the Bible. One of the consequences of this number system has to do with the lost continent or the lost island of Atlantis. The Atlantic Ocean is named after this lost island. Tradition says that sometime in the early Greek history, this island just simply sunk into the sea. Now think about what we know of the Minoan culture. Sometime in the early Greek period, this island just simply blew apart. Maybe it's the same island. Well, if that's the case, then why would the island, either Terra or Crete, or if you like, Atlantis, why would it be placed in the Atlantic Ocean? The number problem could be the answer. Take a look at this. Here we see a map of the Mediterranean, and we've designated where the island of Crete is located. And we've designated the distance between the Greek mainland and Crete by a small line. Let's assume that we were off by a factor of 10, so that when Plato was reporting the loss of the island of Atlantis, instead of saying it was just one distance away from the Greek mainland, what if he said it was actually 10 distances, 10 of those same distances? He was off by a factor of 10 because of the number system. Well, look where that puts us. Past the gates of Hercules, out into the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore he would have called it Atlantis because it was so far away from Greece. But it might have truly been the island of Crete and the Minoan civilization. When the Minoans disappeared, and they did truly disappear, and we believe that it was because of some catastrophe, like perhaps the explosion of Santorini or Terra. When they disappeared, another culture took their place as the trading champions of the Eastern Mediterranean. That other culture was found on mainland Greece, and they are called the Mycenaeans. They are called that because of their principal city, which was Mycenae. They may have conquered the Minoans. They may have just taken over when the Minoans were fighting for their life down on those islands covered with pumice and washed by the tsunamis. Whatever happened, we see that the next major civilization was, in fact, this civilization called the Mycenaeans. Here we see some examples in Mycenaean culture of where the Mycenaeans say that they took precedence over the Minoans. And these stories, legends if you will, really start at the time of Theseus. Theseus was the son of the king of Athens, one of the Mycenaean cities. The legend is that before the time of Theseus, every year the Mycenaeans sent a group of young adults down to Crete, where they were taken by the Minoan king as a tribute. And as part of the Minoan religion, they were sent out into a maze, where in the middle of the maze there was a minotaur, half man, half bull. And the minotaur would chase these young youths around the maze, but because the youths always got lost in this complex maze, they would eventually be caught and would be eaten by the minotaur. So year after year, the flower of Greek society, the Mycenaean society, would go down to the Minoans, and they would be destroyed. But along came Theseus, a very clever young man. He made friends with the daughter of the Minoan king, and her name was Ariadne. They got together and decided that they would defeat the king's evil scheme of sacrificing these people to the Minotaur. Therefore, she gave Theseus a string. Some say it was a spider thread. And he laid it down as he went through the maze back to the location of the Minotaur. And when the Minotaur started to chase them, he was able to run along, follow the string, get out of the maze, and eventually gather the forces to kill the Minotaur. At that point, we see that Theseus becomes the dominant, the Minotaur is killed, and here we see that being pictured on one of the later Mycenaean vases. And we then, from that point on, see that the Mycenaeans took charge and the Minoans faded into obscurity. Well, what was the Mycenaean culture like? We can go to Mycenae today and see the ruins of that famous culture. Unlike the Minoans, which was an island culture with beautiful buildings and granary for storage and beautiful palaces and no walls, we see in Mycenae exactly the opposite. a rugged society with big, heavy walls. One of the walls is still standing partially, and in that wall is a gate. Over the gate is a picture of a lion, and so this is called the Lion's Gate. The king of this society was a king named Agamemnon, and some archaeologists have found a polished gold face that they believe was the face of the king, and people have called it the Mask of Agamemnon. It was found in a burial chamber, a circular mound with layers of buried people inside, and it was the kind of warrior burial that we would expect from a warrior society. So now we have quite a contrast. The Mycenaeans are fierce warriors, the Minoans traders, but not much of warriors because we think they lived on an island and were relatively protected there. So we can compare these two societies, the Minoans with love and beauty and leisure. The Mycenaeans had a religion of many gods, and the gods were quite fierce. They were a warlike society. They gave us a language that is today the precursor to modern Greek, and they had the stories of traits of heroes. The great heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey come from the Mycenaean culture. And as part of the honor of those great heroes, they sacrificed for country, gave bravery and honor. And we see many, many swords and other war implements from the Mycenaean culture. And therefore we see the beginning of Greek culture is really twofold. First the Minoans, and then the Mycenaeans. And from now on, when we talk about Greece, we'll talk about the Mycenaean culture and its descendants. We call that culture simply the Greeks. Thank you.